Thank you everyone again for joining. My name is Sarah Valentine. I lead our partnerships across life sciences here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. I know you're familiar with DIME because you found your way to this journal club, but for those of you who are maybe a little bit less familiar, we are a global nonprofit at the intersection of healthcare and technology dedicated to advancing the safe, effective, and equitable use of digital medicine. And today I'm joined by fellow co-authors of a recent publication in CTS on assessing the net financial benefits of digital endpoints in clinical trials. I'll introduce you to the other speakers here in a moment, but before we get started on that, I do want to run through a few housekeeping items here today. Please note that today's session is being recorded. In order to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we can call on you from there, or feel free to type your question in the question box if you aren't able to unmute your mic. Again, because we are recording this session, we will be making both the recording as well as the slides available through our website. So give us a day or two and that'll be up and ready to share with any colleagues who were able to join us today. But with that in mind, we have panelists introductions up next. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and I'll ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves as well. Let's start with Joe. Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Joe DeMasi, Director of Economic Analysis at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. I've been there for over 30 years, and my research focus has been on the economics of new drug development. And in particular, I've worked a lot on the metrics of new drug development and incentives for innovation. And I should note that not with us today, but there were three others from the Tufts Center who participated in the study: Abigail Dirks, Zach Smith, and Ken Getz.
Thank you, Joe. And the Tufts CSDD team is truly leading a lot of exciting work. So if you're not familiar with them, definitely check out the work that they're leading. Next, Leslie, do you want to unmute and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie Maloney. I'm with Genentech Roche. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and am a global regulatory policy lead for a variety of topics, which include digital measures, patient-focused drug development, AI, other issues like that. So excited to talk with you all today.
Excellent. Thanks, Leslie. And excited to have you here. Bert, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to. Hi, everyone. My name is Bert Hartog. Until very recently, I was leading the growth team on the DIME side. And before, and in full transparency, during the time of writing this paper, I was at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine, where I was leading many of the implementation projects for digital health applications in clinical trials. So this topic of the economies that come with these digital health solutions is very close to my heart, in a very strong connection to the value for patients. And I'm looking forward to the discussion where we can show that value for patients and economic value can go hand in hand. And hopefully that will ignite some very interesting questions and discussion with the audience.
Thank you, Bert. And last but not least, Tom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Tom Metcalf. I work for Roche Pharmaceuticals in the what's called the personalized healthcare team. I've been focused on essentially innovating medicine development, digital health, health data policy, and other related issues for about 20 years now within Roche Global Drug Development. And I've also represented Roche for about 8 or 9 years on the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry Associations, so FPIA, on their innovation committee. So have been also very much involved in the policy discussions related to that, and as part of that role as well, have been involved in a number of IMI and IHI projects, probably the most relevant one of which is what's called Health Outcomes Observatories, which is looking to leverage digital technologies to measure patients' health outcomes and make that data available to all of the key stakeholders in drug development and drug use in across Europe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to all the panelists who are able to join us today for this discussion. Before we get started here, I do want to highlight a few other co-authors who weren't able to make it today. Uta Conradi from UCB. We also had Lada Layens from Takeda, Upinder Grual from Bayer, Dan Carlin from MindMed, and I think Joe highlighted his colleagues Abigail Dirks, Zach Smith, as well as Ken Getz at Tufts, and Jen Goldsack, who will be joining later today. So appreciate all of the co-authors' hard work on this body of work. I think from here, what we'll do is we'll go over a few of the findings from the research that we conducted together, and then we'll kind of break out into more of a discussion on what do these takeaways really mean for the field. We'll start with some panelist discussions, but then we'll open it up to more of a Q&A with all of the attendees here. But certainly if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box throughout, and we'll try to address those as we go. So without further ado, I'm going to go through a few slides. Hopefully this won't be too much of a death by PowerPoint. Chances are, if you're here, you are familiar with the world of digital endpoints and you're familiar with some of the hypothesized benefits. This is kind of a quick screen capture from one of the resources that DIME produced a few years back in the Playbook for Digital Clinical Measures that discusses some of the landscape of benefits associated with the use of digital endpoints and digital measures more broadly in clinical trials. And up until this point, I think, we've surmised a lot of these benefits, but there's not been as much evidence to back up and support these hypotheses. So I think that there has been somewhat slow adoption to date, but what we hope to do through this research was figure out how can we actually quantify the benefits of digital endpoints in order to characterize the value to the other colleagues that we're working with across the drug development system. And so what we did was we initiated this study, and what I'll kind of walk through is, we looked at the benefits, we looked at the costs, and from there we applied an expected net present value model. First things first, though, we'll start with the benefits. And how we did this is we took a look at what was in clinicaltrials.gov at the time. We looked at studies that were initiated after 2005. We wanted to look at interventional studies that industry was involved with. And we really wanted to look at diabetes, CNS, and cardiovascular as therapeutic areas. The reason being that those happen to be the three most frequently seen therapeutic areas in DIME's library of digital endpoints. And so from there, we were able to leverage data that's publicly available in order to analyze some of the differences between studies with digital endpoints and studies without digital endpoints. And we started to see a little bit of a trend. And what you're seeing here is a quick capture of what we saw in the CNS space in particular. As you can see here, the average duration for trials was on average shorter across all phases of clinical research for studies that leverage digital endpoints as opposed to traditional measures and endpoints. And we saw something very similar as it pertained to enrollment as well. Do note that these are all pulled from ct.gov. ct.gov has a quirk where you don't have to report any exploratory endpoints that you're using. So these are primarily secondary and primary endpoints that you're looking at here. But I think that these findings were really interesting, and we saw that reflected when we looked across other therapeutic areas as well. So what you're seeing on the screen now is the predicted values, kind of what we saw with non-digital studies or studies that didn't use digital endpoints compared to studies that did leverage digital endpoints. On average, how much lower was the enrollment size, how much shorter were the trials, and what percent decrease that was. So you're seeing across the board that the benefits here are pretty clear, right? That the studies that leverage digital endpoints were on average shorter and had fewer subjects than more traditional studies. So with that, from there, we wanted to also be able to quantify the costs. You can't have, a net present value conversation without understanding what are the costs of digital endpoints, and we know that those are high. And so what we did in order to quantify the costs associated was we developed two separate surveys that we shared with our partners. One kind of group was more developers, so groups that are developing DHTs, groups that are working on measurement algorithms, those kinds of things. And then we had a separate survey that we shared with our partners across the pharmaceutical and biotech industries in order to better understand what do the costs look like when we compare across all of the organizations that are working in this exciting space. We received several responses. We did have to clean up a lot of the data, and so what you'll see on the next few slides is really what we found. We found that on average, there was around a 780,000 USD cost associated with, and that cost was the amount that was included in agreements with sponsors from the developer survey. As you can see, there's a lot of variation here. We had a very small minimum, a very large maximum. I think that kind of shows that it is still kind of a nascent and growing space. We did see very similar data associated from the sponsor survey as well, right? So you're seeing a very low bar for the minimum costs associated with the use of digital endpoints, and a very, very high maximum in this case, a bit of an outlier there. And so we leveraged this data in order to inform our expected net present value model. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this model, it's widely used across economic kind of analysis. What it does is it kind of looks at the cash inflows. So once a drug is commercialized, what's the revenue that's coming in? With the outflows that are associated with bringing that drug to market, commercializing it, and supporting it throughout its life cycle. So it does account for risk in that sense, specifically the risk of failure across the different clinical phases, and really provides a holistic view of the value of investment into these kinds of capabilities. So when we applied first, I wanted to make sure that everyone had visibility of the different parameters that we used for this model. These are all widely accepted and in some cases very conservative parameters that we leveraged that are available and out there in the literature. But from there, what I'll share first is what we found as a result of the modeling done specifically for phase 2 studies. So when we applied the data that we received both with benefits and with costs, we saw across the board that there was a positive expected net present value delta here, ranging from 2.1 million to 3.3 million, and with ROIs kind of ranging in the 0.3 to 0.5 range. And this is all based on the mean sponsor implementation costs. So you remember we shared that survey and the sponsors responded with, here's how much it costs on average to conduct a clinical trial that leverages digital endpoints. That's the data that we used, and that's what you're seeing kind of in the lighter green columns. In the darker green columns, we used the median, noting that we did have that outlier in the sponsor implementation cost survey. So you're seeing that here as well, that when we applied the median sponsor implementation cost as opposed to the mean, the ROI increased even more greatly. And if that's phase 2, you can imagine phase 3 is multiplied with the scale of those studies. In phase 3, we saw pretty significant ROI associated with the use of digital endpoints in clinical trials, with that ROI ranging from 3.5 to around 6 times the initial investment. And that's using the mean cost. Again, we also did share the median implementation cost as well, which you're seeing is much, much greater. So definitely some exciting results as a result of the work that we collaborated on. What I'll do from here, now that we've had a chance to kind of take a look at the data, talk through some of it, is turn to my fellow panelists here to really think through, we have this data, we have this evidence, what exactly does it mean, and how should we be interpreting it and applying it across the field? So I'd actually like to start with a question. In this particular effort, we looked at financial benefits specifically with regards to the phase duration as well as the trial size. Tom, maybe I'll start with you. Beyond the financial benefits that we uncovered through this effort, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how digital endpoints might impact other important value drivers, and what are some of the broader benefits, that need further exploration. If you can share a little bit on kind of like how you're interpreting these results and where you see future potential work within this space.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think, obviously, drug developers are going to be, very interested in the efficiency gains they can essentially realize in drug development. And a lot of that will be driven by the drivers that you described it, or were described in the publication. So overall duration of the trial, the number of participants, phase duration, etc., etc. One thing which hasn't been addressed in this publication, and it's much more, I think, difficult to measure, is on the probability of success. Do digital measures help ensure the overall success of a particular development phase? I think one of the major things that you can potentially do with digital measures is you can generate measures which are going to be more meaningful to patients and to healthcare systems as they translate into clinical use. And one of the things that we know about many endpoints which are existing regulatory endpoints and are used in clinical trials is that they don't translate easily into meaningful clinical benefit. And I think if we reconceptualize endpoints, particularly using digital tools, we can create measures which can translate into clinical practice and then can obviously translate better into measurable clinical benefit. And this is a key challenge for the industry to be able to convince essentially payers and the public sector that the innovation that we're producing translates into benefit which they can measure in terms of impact on patients and the cost of healthcare systems.
Absolutely. I think those are wonderful insights, and truly thinking about, how are we identifying measures that matter, and not just matter to patients, right? I think, we should be developing measures that matter to patients, but how are we developing and using measures that can be applied beyond just the clinical trial setting? I think that's a wonderful point. Bert, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on kind of a similar question, as how you see kind of how you're interpreting these results and where you think more work might still need to be done.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. First, one addition to the good examples Tom just shared, that is that digital measures, when designed right, help patients take control of their disease, different from the more traditional measures. They give patients control over the way they live with their disease. They give more granular access to insights related to the disease, which facilitates dialogue with their clinician on management of their disease. So that's another one, kind of a patient in perspective, where digital measures can make a difference. Specific to the study we've done, you've shown, Sarah, in the data that a big cost driver is the development and the implementation of these measures. So the way I would anticipate this field to evolve is with the increased use of measures, the development cost will obviously reduce. You don't need to develop the same measure twice. And when you've got a measure developed, you can take parts of that measure into new measures where you don't have to develop from scratch. You can leverage, you can reuse, you can repurpose. So as long as people are willing to share some of the underlying data, then the next measure can be derived from the previous measure, which will drive the development cost down. That is very direct in terms of evolution. Less direct, but probably even more powerful, is when people start using these measures more, there will be a point where harmonization of measures is going to be absolutely essential to continue further the field. Nobody is waiting for a 16th way to measure sleep-related disturbances. What people need to settle on is the 5 or 6 core measures related to sleep disturbance. And that's the standard that you pick from for your trials. That's the standard clinicians need to be trained on for clinical care. So I think in addition to leveraging work already done, the harmonization on which measures to choose from, which core set of measures is most relevant, that will be the biggest impact in driving the field forward.
Absolutely. Appreciate that, Bert. I agree. Joe.
Sarah, can I just make a couple of small additional points? Of course, I agree with everything that Tom and Bert have said. Just to expand a little bit on sort of the first thing I think that Tom mentioned, which is the that we haven't taken account of here, but it could be important, is the impact on approval success rates. And I know from my experience in building these models, the expected net present value models in the pharmaceutical industry, that even small improvements in clinical success rates can have substantial impact on the economics here. So it's an important potential benefit that we're actually not accounting for here. And of course one way to see that is to look back at the results that you presented, Sarah, on phase 2 and phase 3. The expected net present value deltas were substantially higher for phase 3 than phase 2. And the primary driver of that is that if you're talking about an asset that you've already clinically developed at some point, and you're going to be putting it into phase 3, as opposed to an asset that is only going through phase 1 testing, and you're thinking of putting it into phase 2, you're dealing with assets in the phase 3 case that have been substantially de-risked and have a much higher, from that point, a much higher probability of approval than for the assets that are entering phase 2. And so there's a much higher likelihood that the revenue stream for drugs that do get approved is present in a much higher percentage of the assets that are going to phase 3 than go into phase 2. And that just gives you some sense for how much an improvement in success rates can increase the benefits here.
Absolutely. Yeah, we know that phase 2 is where a lot of drugs do tend to fail. And so I think that that's an excellent point, and a great call out here. And certainly, Bert, as you were sharing, I think that identifying kind of opportunities for harmonization and reusability will pave the way for scalability. And certainly we might expect to see some of the ROI multipliers increase even more over time. Leslie, actually, on that note, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how you foresee some of the cost savings associated with digital endpoints evolving as digital health technologies and digital measurement products become more and more widely adopted across different therapeutic areas. How do you see this space kind of changing?
That's how it's changing, and I'll speak a little bit to some of the discussions we're having internally. It touches on what Joe had said related to de-risking. That's where we see most of the value, the ability to fail faster and to get, signals earlier about which products need to move forward. So that's an internal decision-making tool that we very much value. But as this becomes more regular, I think right now we have a lot of the development costs, just like a contract with a third party vendor, like this takes significant time just to set all of these up. And then by the time some of them may be smaller companies, and by the time you maybe have worked things through, maybe they're not in business anymore. Now you're moving on to a next tool. So as we get a little bit more stability, I'm hoping that that timeline and the efficiencies we have from the pharmaceutical side of that startup cost, not even for the measure, just like the how to partner and work with these vendors in a way that will change over time, that it saves us time and it saves us money. I think in the article, we also point to some of the pre-competitive collaborations, and that being a space where we can have some of that de-risking occur there as well, where you're working through a consortia to identify measures, but also to define kind of what are the standards around some of these tools. What does the validation look like for sleep? What is, those basic guidelines that we all are following, so that there aren't, as you said, Bert, the 16th or 60th different DHT that's measuring sleep in some kind of slightly novel way. So that's a lot of the efficiencies that we need to see from the pharmaceutical sponsor side. I think there are difficulties, and maybe this is kind of answering your first question. Right now, the focus internally has been around those internal decision making, because we still see from the regulator side, not just for digital endpoints, but for novel endpoints in general, not a lot of progress in some ways for their acceptance of these approaches. And that is in some ways a behavior change. It's not always the science, but the science can take 20. It can't be that it's 20 years until we're ready to accept a novel endpoint. You have such a great wealth of data. Patients are demanding, healthcare is demanding much faster answers. We have technology that can do this in different ways and can see signals in ways we couldn't before. So I think from that perspective, it is how do we move this ecosystem? How do we have a more readiness from the regulator side to accept novel endpoints in general, not just on the digitally derived endpoints, to make sure, yes, it has to be robust. Yes, we want to be measuring what matters for the disease, but what matters for patients, as Tom pointed out, but getting regulators, open and little, I guess, reducing their own risk adversity related to some of these new technologies and endpoints that we think are meeting and checking all those boxes of matters to patients, advancing the disease, more precise measures than what we had before. But we need to advance and reduce that timeline much more quickly than we are currently seeing.
Absolutely. I love it. Tom, I'll go straight to you.
Yeah, so, just picking up on what Leslie said about the other stakeholders involved in this. And, I think perhaps regulators play a very important role in this, although I think this is, if we're going to advance the field, we're going to need, almost a community effort involving all of the different stakeholders in this undertaking. But if you look at the, just an example at the EMA website, and they've been tracking innovative approaches to medicine development, I think, for around about 15 years. You can count over those 15 years, there are about 15 novel approaches which have been qualified over those 15 years. So, one a year, and about half of those are biomarker related and not digital endpoint related. So it just shows you that this field is currently moving at a very slow pace, in spite of the fact that we realize that, in just for an example, a disease like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, the accepted endpoints are over 100 years old and or the previously accepted endpoints before stride velocity 95 percentile, and were riddled with problems. They had, observer bias. They conflated functional ability with motivation. So you had if patients were differently motivated, they would respond differently or perform differently in the tests. And so, measuring precisely a patient's ability to move, just wasn't that wasn't an endpoint which was used in medicine's development. And I think medicine's developers have, to an extent, been guilty of copying and pasting the endpoints which were used in the last trial or the last few trials which were done in that field, are not fundamentally thinking about the medicine's development toolbox which they have in front of them and trying to optimize that based around the asset that they have. So I think, as Leslie says, there's a lot of space for innovation in this field, but it needs everybody to work together.
Absolutely. And I think that remark in particular reminds me of some conversations. I think I saw a couple of people join the call earlier. But when you think about something like major depressive disorder, MDD, where we're using extremely subjective measures, the instruments themselves might not be the right instruments. They might not be applied in the right way. There could be all kinds of bias. What kind of risk does that introduce to a drug development program? So completely agree with your thoughts there. And Leslie, to your remarks, I think around kind of, and Tom, your remarks around like needing to have all kinds of stakeholders from across the field really coming together in order to drive the maturity of these new capabilities. Bert, I'm curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, very happy to build on Leslie and Tom's comments. And it's mentioned in the article, albeit a little bit difficult to find because it's only a few lines, because we didn't really dive deep into this space. For these new measures to really gain traction, it helps when you understand the value of the measure, not only for clinical development, but also for clinical practice. So when you look at that different, that really calls for a comprehensive digital health strategy across the life cycle of a product. And that's where often we fall short in continuing to isolate R&D from medical affairs and commercial when you look at the business side, or clinical trials from clinical practice when you look on the healthcare side. And if we were able to think through what does it mean for a patient to live with a disease that receives treatment and these new measurements, we typically project out from clinical trials forward into market access, into clinical care. And that route is there to stay. That should not be the only route. We should also learn how to project back from clinical practice into R&D, where clinical practice may be the space where we can develop faster, where we can get new standards accepted faster for measuring on certain characteristics to do with certain disease for certain types of patients. And then we can take that back into research and say, hey, this key opinion leader, this clinical consensus, this professional association for clinicians in a particular therapeutic domain, they settled on a measurement approach for a disease that we can now take into clinical research. And I don't see a lot of that kind of projecting back in approach. And I don't see a lot of R&D, medical affairs, commercial, really thinking through a comprehensive, holistic digital health strategy. There must be opportunities there to accelerate the adoption of these measures.
Leslie, I'll pass it to you.
I think what we started talking about again internally is the evidence generation, that end-to-end evidence generation approach. And as Tom highlighted, there are a variety of innovative approaches that are out there, whether it's real world data, digital tools, all these, model simulation that EMA has looked at, that FDA has looked at. There have been a variety of pilots, but actually deploying those internally. And I would say we as a company have tried a variety of them, but you don't always get the uptake from the regulator. Like, yes, thank you for participating, but we're not quite ready for that, or we didn't like it quite that way. But I think where we're starting to, again, focus internally is we sometimes got in the habit of, someone went to a conference, had a conversation with somebody else that said, they've got this really cool model. They've got this really cool, sensor or wearable that I think we should just put into this study. And it didn't start out with a very strategic question of what evidence gap exists, whether it's on the natural history of the disease or what we know, again, is meaningful to patients, and then determining which tool, whether it's a digital or we can do this with real data, whatever innovative approach helps address that gap. But it starts much earlier than you're in phase 2 or even, phase 3, and let's throw something at it because we recognize we had this gap then. It is a strategic and much earlier conversation that needs to happen in order. And then again, that gives you enough time, whether it is that partnership with a third party vendor who can deliver who has the tool, who's already validated, whatever other pieces, but it can't wait until I think where we found we sometimes wait too long and we don't have the discussion of what gap exists in the evidence and can this digital measure help address that gap, and then getting some clarity, whether it's from the payer, but definitely the regulator. So I live in PDR, regulatory space of, yes, they agree on the context of use and the other aspects and attributes that you're designing and making sure a tool that's already been validated is still fit for purpose for your use you have within your trial. But having that conversation not only internally, but externally with the regulator as early as possible to ensure you haven't progressed down a path that is measuring something that no one's going to find a value, or definitely the regulator is going to say, that's not really what we needed.
The tale as old as time, right? But I think to your point, taking a strategic approach will certainly help us, glean even more value from these digital endpoints. Tom, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah, so just wanted to sort of double down a little bit on what Leslie said in terms of that, being more strategic and the end-to-end approach to sort of evidence generation. I think perhaps one other reason why this is perhaps more challenging than we think it should be is, and I think Leslie touched on this before, the essentially the fragmented landscape of the digital health vendor, digital health startup space, and the fact that it's difficult to find people who can help you invest or underwrite. It's often seen that the pharma company has to be the underwriting most of the risk associated with developing a novel endpoint. And I think apart from the biggest pharmaceutical companies, it's very difficult for particularly for biotechs or mid-sized pharma companies to take on the risk of developing a new medicine and developing a new endpoint concurrently. So this is something which where size makes a difference. And Bert talked about reuse. You probably need to be able to reuse concepts across a whole of the therapeutic area, and to leverage these investments across a portfolio for you to be able to take on this risk at the moment. And that's without having a strong group of external vendors who are able to carry some of the pretty big risks with developing these, particularly getting these endpoints qualified as endpoints for medicine development.
Absolutely. Bert, do you have any thoughts?
I think there's kind of there's two kind of common themes here. One is this this integrated evidence planning, which is really a discipline, but that more people can benefit from. It's relatively new. When you Google integrated evidence planning, it's actually a theme. It's a domain that is growing rapidly. It's a domain that companies are picking up on. It's one where DIME has done some work with ZS and associates to develop some resources that are just there, free for use. That will help think through, to Leslie's point, the strategic thinking in your evidence generation. And it's not limited to, it can only kind of go like waterfall from R&D into commercial. It can go any way you like. It's about understanding that holistic picture. So that is very important. And I'd like to point to those resources. But the other thing is the mindset of pre-competitive collaborations, which is true for farm, and we see that happen quite a bit. But it should also be true for medtech. It should also be true for startups. It should be really omnipresent, and it should go all the way to not only sharing concepts around measurements, but it should also be around sharing some of the baseline data. What does normal look like using a new measure? There should not be a need for a control group using a new measure when another company is using that measure. That would be ludicrous. Why collaborate on developing the measure and compete on generating baseline data? That is not right. So somehow we need to figure out how we can get that baseline data available. So the measure we can harmonize on, we can standardize the way of developing, harmonize on the measure, and then the baseline data should be available so your trial can be even more efficient, because not only are you using a harmonized measure that was developed in a standardized way, but you can also save yourself the trouble of generating baseline data and go straight into your effect, your treatment effect. So, and I think that's again back to strategy, where you really need to be strategic. What do you want to do with your clinical trial? What's the evidence you want to generate? And how much of it can you do outside the trial to minimize the complexity and therefore the probability of success of the trial?
Absolutely. Completely agree with those points. I do also want to remind folks, if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. Erwin has actually put a very interesting question in the chat that I think, Joe, you'd likely have a couple of thoughts on. But Erwin, I don't know if you're in a place where you can unmute and kind of share your question live.
I am. Hi, Sarah. I see some familiar faces here as well. So no, I think it's really very interesting research you're presenting, very much needed. So when I was looking at some of the tables that you were showing earlier, sort of about patient recruitment, let's say the time that the study lasts. So I mean, spectacular results actually, just for using digital endpoints. So the thought that I actually had is that, I mean, did you give it some thought what other variables could cause actually this variance or this difference? I mean, is it just, let's say, the usage of digital endpoints, or are there other factors maybe why these studies were more suited to apply digital endpoints?
Yes, I think I can jump in here. We certainly made efforts to sort of isolate the impact of using digital endpoints. For one thing, the comparator group of non-digital trials were all trials that had the sort of the same, that were studying the same indications for the 3 therapeutic categories that we had for the digital endpoints group. So it's it's a match, if you will, on the indication level. The other thing is that the predicted benefits that we used in terms of shorter durations and smaller trial sizes were the result of a statistical analysis where we controlled for a number of factors that could impact trial duration and trial size, such as the number of sites used, the number of endpoints in the protocol for the trial, the year and to investigate trends, the year in which the trial was initiated. So we made efforts to sort of have an appropriate comparison here between digital and non-digital trials, and so in essence rule out factors that could impact cycle time, duration, and trial sizes, other than whether digital endpoints were employed. Okay.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Any other questions from folks on the line? If not, there's plenty that we can keep chatting through, but I want to make sure that we're given that time and space. Maybe a question from me. I'm curious, we've talked a lot about building strategies in order to develop meaningful measures earlier on in the process. So it's not just a last second, let's throw a digital endpoint in this trial and see what happens type of thing, and more of like a very well thought out and kind of strategic capability for organizations. I'm curious to hear from industry colleagues, what do you think are the primary barriers in order to implementing more of those types of strategies in order to implement digital endpoints across your portfolios, and how you think we might be able to overcome those challenges? I know I heard a couple of thoughts on the current regulatory landscape, the current maturity of the field, but would be curious to continue pulling that thread. Tom, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think some of it is to do with the capabilities which pharma companies have, and ensuring that because a lot of what you're describing is essentially in the translational medicine space. As you move a molecule out of research into development in the early development space, and I mean, I think that we, as an industry, maybe 20 to 30 years ago, we faced a similar issue with biomarkers, that we needed to really beef up our capabilities in terms of biomarker science, and that I guess took sort of like 5 to 10 years for us to build that into and hardwire that into our processes and build the necessary capabilities. But I mean, I think that's the sort of thing that we need to do from a digital health perspective. And Bert talked about this, as well as not just being focused on a waterfall from from development or from drug development forwards, but learning also from the clinic backwards. This requires, to an extent, a mix between translational medicine and medical affairs capabilities, but with a digital focus or a digital health focus. And we simply, these individuals or the people who have this expertise, there's not many of them, and because we don't have or we're only just seeing the value proposition being proved out with data. It's not been a major strategic focus for many pharma companies, and I think that a lot of them have done experimentation, as Leslie has described. Let's try this, let's try that, but until it becomes a strategic imperative to build these capabilities and to think of this end-to-end evidence approach, and ensure that you, as I say, learn from not only from the bench forward, but from the bedside backwards. It's this is what it's going to take for that to be integrated into how medicines are developed.
Absolutely. And I love the note around, is it a strategic imperative? Certainly, I think that's something that we'd hope to see in the future, especially when you think about things like, as another example, like pediatric rare diseases, where there is such an unmet need. Patients are co-located across the world, not necessarily next to the few specialty sites that might exist. Are decentralized trial capabilities a strategic imperative? And how can digital endpoints play a role in enabling decentralized trial, in accelerating what Leslie was talking about before, right? Those go, no go decisions on whether or not to continue pursuing development, or on whether to cut a program, on being able to really accelerate new therapies that could be life-changing and life-saving for children that are living with these sorts of diseases, which we're seeing a lot more of. I think a lot more interest and excitement around these days. I did see that Jen joined as well. Jen, I'd be curious to kind of hear your thoughts. We've been talking about some of kind of the strategic imperative behind the use of digital endpoints, and how we, ways that sponsors can drive more holistic adoption of these capabilities across their enterprise. So would be curious to get your thoughts.
Fantastic. So I was able to hear some of Tom's comments, and I'll go back and watch the recording from earlier. I was living the dream on an endlessly delayed series of flights, which I think is all too familiar to all of us right now. And at some point we need to do a journal club to sort of comparing our notes and data and experience on that. But here's where I land on all of this. And I think we have a couple of minutes maybe just to pull on some threads here before we wrap up. Leslie, I'm really disappointed that I missed some of your examples around how do we actually drive case examples towards establishing the use of digital endpoints as a strategic imperative for our organizations, making sure that we have sufficient capabilities across entire organizations in order, Tom, just like you said, to be able to do this end to end across the entire medical product development lifecycle. And, the question that I have as we look at our industry, which is struggling with 5% technical success rate, which means a 95% technical failure rate, when we know that 1 in 5 trials closes and we put a molecule back on the shelf with no idea about whether it works or not because we can't recruit. When we think about the fact that our industry is dropping, patents are sort of ending and the availability of dollars to invest upstream is going to be limited, and we're entering price negotiations, which is going to sort of challenge us to be more efficient and effective at developing new therapies. I don't know what the plan is to sustain the medical product development industry unless we leverage digital capabilities. Now, digital endpoints are not the only part of that, but they are a fundamental cornerstone component. Every time we talk to a patient and we hear about the facets of their disease that are most important to them, there are opportunities to measure things that matter to patients that we've never captured before. The work that we did, Joe, the analysis that you did on behalf of our sort of multidisciplinary team shows that there's real ROI to be gained here, not incremental, potentially transformative if we bake this in as a core capability to drug development. And we can sort of decrease time to market, which also means that we can unlock revenue quicker and we can ease the suffering of patients more quickly. And so the piece that I think is absolutely imperative, and Sarah, I'm going to sort of pick up on a nuance of your words, is, you were sort of saying, look, I really hope that this strategic imperative is in our future. I want it today. And I think that's what we need to sort of think about as a community. And Sarah, you said, at Dime, we're going to be diving into really trying to focus some of this ROI in the service of patients with sort of rare conditions, mostly because we know that those diagnoses are a death sentence. We're also thinking about how do we actually scale these capabilities across entire organizations. But one of the things I enjoyed most about this collaboration, and thank you to all of you on the line who are sort of our co-authors, was that we share this, I think, passion that we have to get moving on this now. We can't continue to wring our hands and wonder whether we build out these capabilities and invest in these products. And the thing I love about this paper is we've given people a dollar and cents reason to do so.
Absolutely. Appreciate that, Jen, and definitely agree with your thoughts here. I think there's certainly a lot to be excited about. Now we have evidence. I think this was the first paper and research effort of its kind to kind of look into that dollar and cents, what's the value that digital endpoints are providing. And so I think as we start to think of ways of capturing that value, of making digital endpoints more of a strategic imperative, and looking at the way the digital endpoints fit into an overall overarching digital transformation strategy, I think there's a lot to be excited about. I do recognize that we only have 2 minutes left here. Thank you all for joining. I do have a couple of quick call to actions here. Hopefully you're able to see my screen, but we are kind of in the midst of a follow-on effort that will build on this work and develop the more holistic business case for digital endpoints. So definitely stay tuned for those resources, which will launch in Q1 of 2025. I think that will provide a lot more of a holistic way of thinking about kind of building that value proposition for folks across their organizations and building these as strategic capabilities. Please join our future virtual journal club, where we'll be joined by a rock star lineup. Elena, Jesse, and Ben are true experts within this space. And so I'm excited to hear some of their thoughts on the regulatory pathways. You kind of got a teaser for it today, I think, with some of the conversation, but I think that'll be a great way to continue the conversation here coming soon. So thank you again for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. Really appreciate you being here and looking forward to continuing the conversation.